a whole bunch of emails saying, hey, can you buy Viagra, for 25 cents, from Canada? If not, very targeted that they know that you're interested, or, they know, they actually do research into knowing the type of programmers, in case of programming, that they're more in demand in the industry, the type of network engineers that are more in demand in the industry, the type of jobs that are more hot in the industry, big data scientists and things like that they actually put fake job advertisements. And of course, the ninjas of the world, they're us, right? The people that think that we're hackers are the first ones applying for those jobs. And guess what? They actually interview you, and they ask you a whole bunch of questions. And you want that job because it's $300,000, base salary, and you will get, probably, you most definitely are gonna disclose something you should not be disclosing. They're probably gonna ask you, how do you design this network for a service provider? Or how, what is the best technique that your organization is actually doing to be able to do better telemetry, right? And collect logs. What is your log retention policies and everything? You're giving them information for free. Right? Anyways, that's pretty easy to do, right? So this is the things that we've been preaching for a long time about human stupidity, right? So there's no patch for that. The campaigns are getting also into, if there's a natural disaster, they actually are really quick. Just how many of you know that there was a couple of earthquakes? Luckily nothing happened, but in Chile, right? Yeah. Right after that, you saw a whole bunch of people, not the ones from the news, or not the ones that probably have families in Chile, if not actually a lot of spamming campaigns against that. And spam is dying. Actually, spam is a dying. You can call it technology or a technique, but it's still successful. Now, this is actually something that is not dying, and so I work for an organization. I'll introduce myself later. I didn't want to actually introduce this, but I work for Cisco, and basically what I do is I investigate all the bad news for Cisco. So all the security vulnerabilities, all the advisories that you see published, that comes from my team. So we have a team of, we're called Security Research and Operations, and we have a team of researchers that of course, reverse engineer malware. We do analysis, threat intelligence, and everything to be able to better protect customers. And in a lot of cases, it's actually not even with Cisco gear, right? So it's whatever we actually have, whatever Swiss Army knife we have, my main mission is to protect customers. So what we do is we have, companies that we acquire like SourceFire. We have different organizations that we work outside of the company, and we collect a lot of data that will allow us to actually see what is a threat landscape in the future, right? So hopefully you're never going to be able to be ahead of the curve, but be really right there, right? So one of the things, we acquired a company a while back, and from that we have a service called Web Security Services. So all the customers that we have there, we probably have about 1.2 million users in that. Most of the compromise that we were actually seeing, and specifically in calendar year 2013, were related to Java, right? And it was huge. It was like, you see graphs, and 91% of those web exploits being Java related. Is like, wow. The thing is that is the low-hanging fruit, and people are still going to be using it, right? So if I'm actually able to make money, if I'm able to be successful exploiting, why I'm not going to move to something that is more complicated? At any rate, this is one thing that is shifting. Wow, that is a big difference from what you see there, basically. But it's a huge difference than what we actually probably had even 3 years ago. If you were going to and this is BSides, so I'm not gonna be shy. If you're going to a pornographic site, right? In most of the cases, you will expect that there will be some malware embedded somewhere, whether it's a video, whether it's JavaScript, whether it's PHP unsecured, whether you're being redirected to half of the world and back. That's not the case anymore. Most of the compromise are actually getting now through legitimate corporate websites and through search results. So even more than pornographic sites that 3 years ago were the top ones, it's not anymore. Why? Because if I trust that I can go to Cisco.com and hopefully Cisco actually has good security to protect their infrastructure and not being a victim of cross-site scripting and then sending me to a malicious link, I will be a lot more successful in that. And there's a lot of opportunity for you to do that because if you keep up with the top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities year after year, things like cross-site scripting, cross-site forgery, they're always there. And there's so many unsecure, especially things that are now residing in very powerful environments like the cloud. The other thing, I mentioned Java before. I don't know, whenever you install Java or update it and everything, it says, however many billions of users, whenever I made this slide, it was 3 billion users, Java. If it's 91%, that's a huge population that I can get to. But at any rate, I didn't come here to actually talk about web exploit that much or what the threat landscape as a whole is. I came here actually to talk more about how networks are actually still getting pawned, and most in the networking technology. How many of you are network engineers or network security engineers? Okay. Pen testers? Researchers? Reverse malware engineering? Just pawnage for the hell of it? Anyways, the presentation that I have right here, it will concentrate a lot into networking, but I will actually show you how networks haven't been the candy for hackers before, and they're actually now being a lot more attractive than they used to be even 2 years ago. Because if I can actually change infrastructure and redirect, packets like actually Paul was mentioning and everything, I have a lot of more return on investment for a campaign. And the other thing is that if I can combine that with the traditional, Java vulnerabilities and PHP exploits and everything, I'll be more successful. And at any rate, one thing that you're seeing is by 2020, and this is actually pretty low. It says 15 billion things are actually going to be connected to the internet. There's going to be more. 99% of the things are still not connected to the internet. That camera right now, unless is a new model, I don't think that it's connected through Wi-Fi right now. It may be actually doing this through Ustream or something, but this microphone is hopefully not connected unless somebody else bigger than us is listening right now. But the shift that you're seeing right now and that we're seeing is what we call the Internet of Everything, right? So things being implanted into plants, literally plants, and calculating if you actually need more water, less water, more vitamins, to be able to actually talk back to potentially some type of cloud service and be able to tell you, hey, this plant actually, or your grapes that you're actually doing for wine needs more water, so you can actually have a good harvest this year. Right? So those are the things that you were not seeing before. But those are the things, like Paul was actually mentioned now, SCADA, that are really left unsecure right now. How many of you are familiar with Shodan? Okay. So Shodan is a pretty nifty thing. Actually, that's better. Thank you. And Shodan is a nifty thing where you can, basically it's a search engine. Think about Google for the unprotected devices that are on the internet. Right? So from your wireless router in your home to industrial control systems to that camera, streaming to Ustream or whatever the case might be, right? That is a huge shift that we actually are seeing right now. So the more connections, of course, the more threats that you get. The other thing is that what we're seeing is a lot of shift in mentality of people. How many of you think that for the most part, employees actually, they try to obey corporate policies? So of course, we did a study, actually Stanford University was there, a few Fortune 500 companies were there, and we interviewed their IT people, the people that actually are creating these policies and creating infrastructure to support them. And 50% of them, even though it's 50-50, what we say, but 50% they actually thought that the employees were, for the most part, obeying their technologies. Of course, it's full. Typically, whenever it says at least they try, or they're a fear that some, especially the less educated ones, there's some fear that by not obeying what is there, of course there's going to be some attribution. Of course, that's the main purpose of it. But the reality is at least 71% of the employees said that deliberately they did not obey security policies. This is including their IT personnel. This is including their security people. I am not obeying the security policies. I'm putting a dual home machine in my network in my house that is also connected to a router or a device that is connected to VPN to the corporate side. Right? So, for example, I'm sending sensitive documents to my Google Docs account and store it there and probably share it to the whole world. That something that should never be outside of their organization.
Where did those numbers come from? Was that who did the study?
Yeah. So this was actually a study done by, so Cisco was participating in it, Intel, Microsoft, basically all the ICASI members. I can give you more information. Stanford University and Merit were there as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So who are the hackers, right? So everybody, that's why I put a big line in there. Within that, we consider all ourselves, of course, hackers. Not necessarily a bad thing, but who are those big bad actors right now, right? So from the typical, hacktivism, I want to protest against anything, the room is too hot or something, I'm going to hack the network, or I don't know, somebody's actually protesting outside that Omar is doing a presentation here, or BSides is actually, a whole bunch of hackers are actually in Puerto Rico trying to hack the world. Of course, there's always going to be some type of protest. There's also a little bit more organized things, right? So we always see, things popping up like SEA, the Syrian Electronic Army, right? So that's kind of old news now. We have very resourceful teams across the universe, and of course, because that bad taste, everybody's actually pointing to China, everybody's also pointing to the US, so there's a huge fight between the nation state and everything. But the reality of things is that, again, everybody's a target and everybody has resources to do, offense and defense campaigns, right? The other thing is that according to Forrester research, insiders, whether it is the malicious insider or whether it's the unintended insider, accounted for the top sources or the top breaches in the last, this is 12 months from December of last year, so basically the whole 2013. This is a link, or have a link of the source of the information, but only 57% of them, they're actually saying that they are aware of even organization security policies at all. This is even including their IT personnel, right? So that's a huge shift of what we actually saw before. Wow, this is not rendering correctly. But the other thing is that a lot of organizations, and actually this is from computerweekly.com, and a study that they actually had, definitely are not doing enough to detect the insider threat information. Less than a third of the respondents of their survey said that they actually block unprivileged users, and even the people that probably say that they block them, they're probably lying, and I'll explain to you why. Now, so the other thing is that who am I? Who hired me? You actually, right now we're living in a world of trust, right? So there's no true saying of even with background investigations, and even after, and this may sound like a post noting a comment and everything, but even with that, you have no way of actually saying what is in actually somebody's mind right now. But I can tell you who actually hired me, so at least I'll introduce myself really quickly. My name is Omar Santos. That's my PGP key. Again, like I mentioned, I investigate all the bad news for Cisco. We're a team of engineers around the world that we take all this bad news, all the vulnerabilities, and it's not only for Cisco products, but also vulnerabilities that affect the whole industry. So, for example, if there's something that relates to TLS, to TCP, something that is industry-wide, we also engage into those activities. And you cannot see it from there. My email address is really easy. It's os@cisco.com, and my Twitter handle is in your program. So that's about me. Enough about me. Going back to the presentation, this is a study done by Verizon. Actually, it wasn't the Verizon data breach investigation report from last year. The time of detection and the actual detection of the breaches, that gap is increasing dramatically year over year, right? So we're not definitely staying ahead of the curve, but we're actually falling behind the curve very, very, very dramatically. I think that either Paul or somebody actually earlier today mentioned that, hey, we're already assuming that we're being hacked. That is actually the mentality, right? So actually that is the mentality to have, because nobody, including my own company, including governments, can actually say that they're 100% secure, right? So that type of mentality is actually shifting. But what is actually shifted and is getting more complicated is that that complexity in the networks is not what it used to be even 5 years ago, right? Things are actually now residing into very, very dynamic environments, and where security is just a second thought, right? And especially, even if you have all the recommendations in the world, and you have an army of people that you can train, and you have an army of people that actually can, allegedly defend against these, type of threats, the problem is that, especially in big corporations, if they're not agile, if they don't shift the ways that they do business, they probably will not be in business in the next 5-10 years, right? So even whenever you say, okay, something extremely fundamental, like change management control, and making sure that, of course, you're not enabling, like Paul was actually mentioning, lawful intercept, incorrectly, or enabling, something that is probably an insecure best practice in your environment, because you actually track them. You say, okay, my maintenance window is not going to be until 3 weeks from now. In today's environments, you may actually have even change of maintenance windows throughout the day. Why? Take a look at the example of Netflix. They probably do big, major fundamental changes 2 or 3 times a week while you're actually watching TV. Because while you're watching, somebody or while you stop watching, somebody in the West Coast in the US started watching. So there's not so much of off hours anymore, right? And in very dynamic environments like that, how can you control that? How can you control security, right? So it's getting a lot more complicating as we speak. The other things, like I mentioned, we actually have an any-to-any problem, right? So this mega trends of everything being connected, your wireless device, your stove, hacking your refrigerator and your AC, of course that's actually contributing to the problem and the complexity. But if you actually look into the threat of evolution, really from the earlier 2000s, where we started with worms, and we have things like spyware, rootkits, being developed in the 2005. We call APTs, advanced persistent threats, but there's a joke out there that says my APT is bigger than your APT, because there's no true definition of what an APT is. It can be a campaign of many, many, many different vulnerabilities being exploited, or it can be a very sophisticated malware that is embedded into a industrial control system, right? So that is what you're seeing in the early 2010s. But what you're actually going to see now is that these campaigns, they also have the capabilities of doing what you're doing for defense. So in other words, to be able to actually use cloud-based technologies and even big data to see what is actually the return on investment on whatever malware campaign do I have. There's malware being actually right now distributed in the black market and exploit kits that will tell you the return on investment, and based on that return on investment or return of exploitation, they increase the price or they lower the price of that. It's a complete, different landscape right now, right? I mean, they're putting money into this type of malware, and this type of campaigns that they actually are able to sustain an underground economy, just like Wall Street is doing valuations of companies. So it's a big shift in paradigm. So companies actually have to think about this, and also think on the talent that they actually have to be able to, again, not stay ahead of the curve, but being very close. The other thing that is shifting is that now I'm considering myself an old guy, right? So I think that I don't see that many people probably under 18 right now in here, right? So, but most of the millennials, or the 21 or 18-year-olds right now, they did another study, and they asked, and this was actually in Stanford University, and they actually asked about one of the questions was, is there any privacy? And everybody actually said no, the privacy is a thing of the past, right? So the other one is that even if you knew that potentially, I don't know, like I cannot say, I have an Android phone, but even if you knew that Android malware increased 2100% last year, you're actually gonna change the way that you do business. And basically their answer was that they rather have the flexibility and then think about what the repercussions of that type of risk than actually just tie it completely. So the question right now that most organizations are actually thinking is, do I really have to tie everything, or should I actually let go? If I tied everything, I'm not going to be able to be flexible, I'm not going to be able to be competitive, and I may not be in business 5 to 10 years from now. That's the big shift that we have. And this shift is more than just your phone, right? And we used to have a joke at Cisco with all these acronyms, and all these buzzwords, BYOD, cloud, and everything. And a friend of mine says, anytime that you actually say BYOD or cloud or Internet of Everything, drink, right? So take a friggin' shot, right? And it is true, and it's very hard for me to say because, Cisco makes products that do for BYOD and everything. I'm not saying that they're bad solutions. What I'm saying is that it goes beyond the technical abilities of your network, right? So what will it, I guess, again, I'm in a team that we investigate everything bad in Cisco, and subsequently we actually have a lot of access to information, right? New products being developed, new technologies being developed. We actually try to think on how we can increase not only the trustworthiness of the products, but of course the overall security of the products. So what is it preventing me to walk to a lab right now, or X meeting, and take a picture of an engineering document, and I will never touch your wireless device because I have a LTE connection which is a lot faster than the wireless devices that you actually have, and I already extradited the information, encrypted, without nobody being able to detect. So even if you have all the technologies in the world, whenever it comes to BYOD and everything, it's also a matter of the shifting of trust. So you're gonna see me repeating that a lot. How many of you know what that is? So the reason that I have that in there is because, of course, we have even penetration testing packages. You can run here anything that you want, Kali Linux or whatever, right? But what is actually shifting is that the technology itself, especially something like this. How many of you know what that is? A what?
Power
A
strip.
power strip?
Power
Yeah.
strip, right?
And
USB port, no?
it's really hard to see.
The Cisco router.
You cannot see here, but it has two Ethernet ports, and it has two Ethernet ports and a USB. Basically, that's an embedded device, a computer that people can label, and we actually did this last year in Vegas, and we put internet connection in here, and we actually enable internet. So people, even the security guys in the world, we're actually plugging in their things, their laptop in there, and their Ethernet connection there too, right? So for things that are non-traditional, you can do a lot of freaking harm, right? Like that. You don't need to see something that you will say, man, that doesn't even have a case or anything. You can embed it to things like this and then cause a lot of harm. This is actually awesome. This is a product that, how many of you know what Pony Express is? Yeah, unplug and everything. That's one of their new products right now. You put that in the conference room, you connect it to the network, and you can do a lot of things. And nobody's actually going to know that is actually, you know, a computer, rather than something hanging, you know, like a Raspberry Pi from your Ethernet port. All right, this is another big, huge shift that we're seeing right now. You only need either one or two people, right, and a credit card to right now create your own company and do a cloud service, and boom, probably you become, you know, the next Amazon. It's as easy as never been, right? So you and me right now may not have money, but he has a credit card, and we say, okay, you know, let's actually spun up a new web service or a new, I don't know, app that will detect if there's parking here or not, and we boom, you know, with the next Instagram and Facebook, you know, buys them for $1 billion. Right? So that's there. That's awesome. That is absolutely awesome. I'm all against, you know, pro against that. But at the same time, you have two guys and a credit card, and you have the cloud, and you can use that cloud for DDoS. You can use that cloud to store malware, and you can use that cloud for spam. And especially concentrated on DDoS. How many of you knew about the financial DDoS campaign between May of last year until around November? I'm sorry?
OPUSA.
Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah. So there was a mix of things. It's what they actually call volumetric attacks. Even though you have the traditional DOS and reflection attacks, you know, DNS reflection attacks, and now even MTP being exploited. There were one compromising big, huge cloud machines, right? I'm not gonna go into the details of who the cloud providers are, but huge cloud providers, launching them against them, or the UpUSA, and of course, you know, getting things like LOIC and everything on people's machines, and even getting people that will volunteer to cause that harm. People that actually don't like Bank of America, should let's say, you know, I said Bank of America, I know there's a name, but a Bank of America, you know, anywhere in America, if they don't like it, you know, I'll volunteer, I'm gonna click, you know, a button that they don't even know what they're doing, they just know that, you know, this is the target, and just like that, you can recruit a lot of people. If you combine that with a credit card and launch attacks from a cloud provider, now you're not having megs of traffic, you're having gigs and potential terabytes of traffic in the future actually coming into a single target that they're not going to be able to keep up. Not only the companies are not able to keep up, but in those cases even the providers were falling over. The providers that actually had solutions to be able to do, you know, scrubbing for DDoS. So that's a big shift that from the traditional DDoS that we saw, that yeah, you can exploit or you can actually launch an attack, into now combining hacktivism with organized things and launching campaigns like this using stolen credit cards to get machines in a cloud provider. The most interesting part in that, this is actually a little bit more clever. While I was actually working in some of these activities and looking at the behavior of these type of attacks, we also saw, and whenever I say we, the industry, the financial sector and the private sector, we saw a new thing that was fairly clever. There's a lot of mitigations now for it. But while these attacks were actually happening, miscreants were actually launching also attacks against the IVR systems for the credit cards. So if I stole your credit card and I stole yours, the first thing they're gonna do is go back to your credit card, in the back there's a 1-800 number, and you're gonna call, right? And what they were doing is that simultaneously they were actually launching campaigns against those IVR systems, so you cannot get through. So the only thing that they needed to is a couple of hours of you reusing your credit card, or not to stop it, or the next batch, because it's not so much of one credit card, it's a huge batch. And if I know that my victim is X bank, and the back of the credit card number is published everywhere, if you cannot get through, of course, I'm more successful. So you are seeing, two different things that you will never, people traditionally will never think about before. There's another huge problem right now, and it's what we call the I don't care problem, right? So if you're hired by a company to protect the infrastructure, and right now you don't have no incidents and everything is good, your boss is good, everybody has a B word in their head, which is boss. Your boss is happy and everything, and I come to you and I say, Dave, I think because your organization, this other smaller organization is being attacked right now, right? And there's only allegations, there's nothing, there's a lot of I don't care, type approach. It's not my problem, right? Until really it is a stepping stone attack coming from an organization, and you have somebody in your door that is not the other organization, but it's law enforcement to come into it, right? There's a lot of things that we cannot do much about that. There's a lot of things that we actually have to recognize and be able to be dependent and have the ability to be able to protect our infrastructure, to be able to protect others, right? Especially for things like I mentioned, the cloud providers and DDoS, right? So, you can rent a machine. Whatever you do with that machine is not their problem, right? So they're not the people launching the thing, but they actually are the owners of the infrastructure, right? So it is for the best interest that they actually protect that and be able to, if there's something abnormal behavior in the machines, of course, cutting them off. The other one is that in most cases, like I mentioned, we cannot do much about it, but what we actually have to do, and whenever I said cannot do much about it, is that if you're the victim because somebody else, is not protecting their infrastructure and they're using them as a stepping stone attack, because you don't own that equipment, you don't own that infrastructure, and you don't own that company, right? Even if you want to actually go into the legal route, it will take a long time to do that, and by that time the attack is over. But what you have to do is to be able to recognize that can be, that's part of your risk assessment, that something, whoever you do business with, right, not only think about that, they're actually using encryption to communicate with me and everything, but what response plans they actually have. A lot of things that I'm seeing in contracts in big Fortune 500 companies right now is embedding things like how do you keep up with third-party software security? Do you have an incident response team that I can call, and if there's something malicious going on, that you can act upon? Something that you never saw in contracts 3-4 years ago. Right? That big shift is actually, or that big mentality is shifting incredibly right now, that are being part of conversations of closing a deal, right? Or even doing business with you. So, now what other things are actually changing? I mentioned, complexity, and I think that you came here mostly for the technical stuff. Wow, you cannot see that. But basically, we have a big shift, and it is not only, of course, Cisco calls it ACI, but it's a way on where networking is actually going to change fundamentally. How many of you are familiar with SDN, software-defined networking? Okay, so not that many. How many of you know what a router is? Right. So that router, that physical box that is controlling either your network here or the internet, that is actually shifting hugely right now into being based on software, right? On where I don't have to hire or hire people or configure physical boxes anymore. If I can automate that process whenever, in the case of Netflix, the guys from the West Coast, wake up and they start watching TV. The whole network is orchestrated without nobody actually even doing anything. The whole network can be orchestrated or being configured based on the need of an application. Right? So that's what the big shift you're actually probably going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, is that networks are not going to be known as themselves as they are right now. They're going to be all, a lot of them are going to be based on software, and they're actually going to be based on many different things, especially with automation being the big hard part of it. Right? Why? Because you need that application agility, right? You need for being able to say, I want to create a new product or a new service or react into a market shift, and then have the ability to deploy that without hiring a guy that manages the firewall, a guy that manages a switch, a guy that manages the application and everything. If not, build all that information into the into the network itself and actually configure things on the fly, right? That's scary whenever it comes to security, right? Because if we're screwing up, right now security with simple networking 101, right? So router, switch, firewalls, and things like that. Imagine whenever it's actually dynamic and it's being created dynamically on the fly, right? The other thing is that you're actually going to see a lot of applications or networks being orchestrated, and you're actually seeing it right now, and then disappearing in a while. So for me, as an attacker, to actually leverage that infrastructure, right, especially the control plane of that infrastructure, right, and being able to spawn things for my campaign and then completely remove it from the network, for you to do forensics is going to be a huge new environment for you to be able to react, right? I also mentioned, I'm not going to bore you to death with all these animations in here since you cannot see it that much, but I also mentioned that the traditional things like SLA, QoS, and the three-tier approach of applications, like for example, you have the presentation layer, right? So some type of web environment in most cases, an application right behind it, and of course you need data to probably feed to that application. All that shift is changing into what we call application infrastructure components, or basically we call it ACI APIs, but basically it's an API to be able to say, okay, this application, like you saw before, this application is a web, based application that has, this type of requirements and this type of communication between the presentation layer and the app, and the app to the database. And traditionally, you will segment them. You will put firewalls in between. You will configure VLANs into between. You will configure MPLS VPNs to be able to segment that. Now, in this case, you can't do that. There's all this is in a virtual environment. So what is changing is that by way of actually knowing what the applications and that communication will be, policies are going to be created on the fly for that need. So this is going to be extremely powerful, because now you don't have to, again, hire an army of people to configure all these environments and firewalls and VLANs and everything. If not, they're going to be created on the fly. Now, for security, that may be good for agility, but as far as actually securing that infrastructure, it's going to be probably one of the biggest challenges you're actually going to see in the next 5 to 10 years. Right? Be able to actually keep up with that. I'm not going to bore you to death. I want to go over a few more things, and I know that lunch is almost here.
Last time, Bobby.
Yeah. So basically, this is more of the more interesting meat of the presentation. How can we keep up? What is actually the call to arms? We actually have to look into things in the network that have been what I call the Swiss Army knives of security, right? So from the traditional login, attribution, to looking at all the pockets that we actually have in our disposal, to be able to prevent, to be able to detect, to be able to collect, to be able to analyze, and of course mitigate. This is what I actually called, tooling an army of, good guys. These are very, very simplistic things that still can be applied to those complex environments, and I'll provide this as a reference. So I know that you guys cannot actually see it, but I have based on the event type or what you actually want to achieve, whether it's attribution or system activities or web logs and everything, what can you actually look for, what can you activate in your network to be able to detect and protect a lot better, right? So from the traditional NetFlow environment, and I know that there's actually a NetFlow talk as we speak right now, and server syslog, even to things that are more advanced, especially for ACI and some of those environments. Now, the problem is you have all these tools and you have all these capabilities in there, but who's actually going to keep up with the logs, right? Who actually has the time or the people to keep up with these logs? At Cisco right now, and actually this is old, you can see, I think this was December of last year, we were getting about 27, this is on Cisco's infrastructure itself, in the US only, we were getting about 27 events per second, right? That's 1.8 million events per day, and that's actually pretty low right now. That's only for the US, right? So, I mean, if you look globally, this is way bigger than that. Who actually has an army of people that can actually go through that? You have to depend on analytics, and you have to depend on non-traditional things that were not in existence for what we consider security people 3-5 years ago, right? But don't get discouraged, right? So the problem is huge, and I'll give you some pointers at the end, but there's some very fundamental things that you can actually do with automation and without automation to be able to detect and at least better protect or better change your environment. I mentioned things like NetFlow. NetFlow is extremely valuable. If you combine that with DNS records, so what DNS, what people actually are going to, based on what your DNS servers are actually resolving to, and you combine both of them, they can definitely be your friend. The reason is, this is a very, very simplistic question, right? So, how many of you work in a company, in your government or a company, or you? I hope that most of you, if you're working by yourself, you have to tell me the recipe. But a lot of us actually work for companies and everything, and especially if they're companies based here in Puerto Rico or in the United States, we have what we call the embargo countries, right? So Libya, Cuba, and all that stuff, right? So if you ask any Fortune 500 company if they're actually going to one of these embargoed countries at 2 o'clock in the morning, in a lot of scenarios they will not be able to tell you if yes or no, right? So even if we have all these tools, why at 2 o'clock in the morning I'm going to all this, I'm still talking to not only things that we know that are malicious, but embargo countries that we should not even be doing business with from the beginning, right? So even if you actually have this massive amount of logs and you don't even know where to start and everything, start from what is actually the very fundamental things. At 2 o'clock in the morning or ever, I should be able to actually be talking to X. I mean, if you actually see information being extradited from some of those sites, you know that something is actually wrong within your environment, right? So those are very, very fundamental things that people sometimes actually overlook, right? The other thing that is actually shifting is the way that how the bad guys are communicating and controlling their CNC boxes and the zombies to cause harm, right? So the compromised machines. Before you saw IRC, before you saw encrypted channels and everything, even now through Twitter, you're actually able to control, basically to control zombies and your CNC boxes out in the wild. This is actually a true example, and I have some bit links in here of how this random tweets that you see in there, they're base64 encoded messages of actually controlling, a couple of things that are fairly malicious out there. And I have this is actually something from January of this year, but I have a new example. I just don't have it in the screen, but once I post the slides or I give it to the folks to post, I'll include the other example in there. Now, again, thousands upon thousands of logs, DNS traffic, you have to investigate, put NetFlow and everything. Of course, everybody on the dog has a commercial solution of how you can do that type of analytics in there. In some cases, you don't need, and this is pretty hard. We sell, so we I'm more than glad that Cisco can sell you all the stuff in the world to be able to do this type of analytics. But if you're starting from scratch right now and you're not collecting any of these things, there's a lot of things that you can actually do for free. Right? A lot of people that I go and I help, whether it's doing some type of forensics activity or some type of customer engagement and everything, and we ask, hey, are you using NetFlow, which is free? And they say no, and the reason is because we don't have any infrastructure to actually support it. Well, there's a lot of open source tools that you can actually start. Of course, depending on how complex your network is, you have to scale, but at least to actually get familiar and put them into very specific sections of your network that you can actually do. As far as mitigation, you can do things like in buying traditional DNS boxes that you already have in your infrastructure. You can do things like called RPCs, right? So you don't have to do a really costly, complicated solution. You can actually use DNS as whitelisting or blacklisting environments for your organization and be able to mitigate specific threats, right? Especially the things like I mentioned, while you're talking to embargo countries at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? Even you can actually play with things of blocking Facebook if you want to block Facebook, at a specific time, or you can also play with routing in case of people are not using your DNS server and they're using 8.8.8.8 or 8.8.4.4, that you can actually point to a DNS server that not only will resolve but will actually log their activity of why they're actually not using your DNS server, and so they're not gonna know. For them, they're actually going to 8.8.8. Most of these folks are not gonna know. They're not going to Google because they don't have the way of saying that. If something is already replying to them, right? So there's things that you can actually do for free, and again, you actually have the more complicated environment, and this is actually what is a lot of the security focus is actually shifting right now into looking at non-traditional tools, especially open source tools like Hadoop, Hive, and things like that to do big data analytics, and whenever your logs are so massive, right? So I'm not going to go into a lot of this because lunch is already there. My apologies for this, but I'll include some pointers in here on how security is actually shifting, especially in big data environments, and how even jobs are going to be changing in the future, on where security folks are also going to be data scientists, or data scientists are also probably going to be engaged in security, in the very near future, right? Even using things like Elasticsearch and everything. One thing that I want to actually close with, and I have a couple more slides with some recommendations and everything, but what you're doing here right now with BSides, and what you're doing in Puerto Rico, I'm actually extremely proud of what you guys are doing here, because community is the #1 thing. As a matter of fact, for the most complicated vulnerabilities out there that affect not only a single company, in this case Cisco, but if not the industry, like TLS and TCP, like I mentioned before, we cannot just rely on our people. We actually have to think about like a community and look for solutions to these problems, and that's what you're fomenting here, is actually building that type of community, and BSides is one of them. In case of even Fortune 500 companies, I actually have more calls with competitors like Juniper and other companies troubleshooting an issue, a vulnerability, that in some cases is my own people, right? Especially whenever it's mitigating a huge risk for the benefit of the internet, right? So one of the things that actually we're doing is we have a non-profit organization called ICASI, and Cisco is a member of it, as you see next to Cisco, Juniper, Microsoft, Juniper. Google is about to join as well. And these are things that are non-traditional, that where we actually look, it doesn't matter if you have a product or not to sell, we have to look for solutions into this type of market trends and security trends, security landscape trends that are affecting the problem. But again, I wanted to give you kudos into that and close with that, and thank you so much for your time, and sorry that we shift a little bit. One of the presenters, and thanks to Paul to actually jumping in there. But thanks for your time, and if you have any questions, I'll be here the whole day. Sí. Ya, no. Tu Marco, sí.
Sí, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo
Ya,
te va?
no, bien, todo bien.
¿Ves
Un
bien,
poquito
coño?
ahí, ¿tú?
Te ves bien, carajo.
Men, no estoy bien. No, yo estaba dando una charla en Cancún en noviembre.
Ajá.
Y cuando estoy saliendo de la freaking conference center, me resbalé, así. Y de aquí me hicieron una operación desde acá hasta acá. Y ahora me estoy muriendo ahí.
Coño. Deja presentar la Victoria.
Es buena,
Este,
¿cómo está?
Omar Santos.
Interesante.
Sí, me perdone, porque lo que pasa es que no apareció uno de los presentadores.
Sí, pero
Sí, que estaba en el-
fantástico.
Sí. Y la cuestión fue que tenía demasiada presentación y there's no way. Y la cuestión que el meet estaba al último, no lo que cubrí. Me siento un poquito mal, pero claro, eso que.
Habrá otra presentación.
Pero, ¿dónde lo vas a presentar otra vez?
Eso yo lo presenté en varios. Tenemos una conferencia que se llama Triangle Infosec con ISSA, el loco en RTP, lo presenté en Cancún, Perú, Costa Rica, pero un poquito más técnica. Lo que pasa es que cuando yo me iba a presentar esos slides, iba a presentar algo más que las personas pues, puedan ver the real exploitation and everything. Pero cuando Paul empezó y preguntó, how many of you are not working? Nobody raised their hands. So, wow, okay.
Okay.
So, I have to plan B.
Estaba bueno, fíjate.
Bueno.
Ahora me intentó hacerlo.
Gracias. Yo tengo aquí la mía es bastante fácil. El email address es osaccessful.com, pero yo creo que todavía tengo que hacerlo.
¿Ese PowerPoint va a estar disponible?
Sí, si no yo lo mismo lo posteo. Y voy a postear otro que era el que yo quería presentar, que es un poquito más técnico.
Ah, pues chévere.
Sí.
Sí, me interesa también. Excelente.
Pues gracias, Omar.
Pues gracias. Gracias.
Nos vemos. Voy a comer. Tú vas a estar por aquí, ¿verdad?
Vamos.
Sí, yo voy a estar aquí.
¿Y esta es la primera vez que tú vienes para B-Sides o es la segunda vez?
¿En Puerto Rico?
Sí.
En Puerto Rico sí. Yo organicé B-Sides en Raleigh, en North Carolina.
Sí.
Y este año lo estaba organizando otra vez. El año pasado traje a Dave Kennedy, traje a Dia de Open DNS. HD popped up for me.
Alpha and Bravo for lunch. Yes. All right.
¿Vas a comer o te vas a
Sí,
quedar?
voy a comer.
Ok, te veo ya.